Madam President, I want to talk about what we're doing today and how important it is and really how unique it is in the history of the country. Since 1789, 112 people have served on the Supreme Court. It's hard not to be reminded today as we vote for the replacement for Justice Scalia that he served on the court for 26 years after Ronald Reagan, who appointed him, left the White House, and 13 years after President Reagan died. So clearly, the impact of a Supreme Court appointment for a nomination for the president, a confirmation for the Senate, is one of those things that has the potential to last long beyond either the service of those in the Senate at the time or certainly beyond those the president at the time. And so it's a significant decision. You know, a federal court appointment, generally, an appointment for life, is different than an appointment that for someone who serves during the tenure of the president. And I think almost all of us look at judicial appointments differently than we look at cabinet appointments and other appointments that are concurrent with the president's term. This is an appointment that lasts for as long as the judge is willing to serve and able to serve. And at 49 years old, Judge Gorsuch, who's already been a judge for 10 years, so he should know that whether he likes being a judge or not, and it would appear, and we would hope that he would have a long and healthy life to use his skills on the court. I think those skills were very obvious in the over 2,000 decisions he's been part of the 800 decisions he's written as a circuit judge, the appeals judge above other federal judges and right below the Supreme Court. So someone who comes to this job understanding the job with a significant body of work that the Senate's had plenty of time to look at and the president had time to look at before this nomination was made, in that those 800 opinions Judge Gorsuch has written, he's been overturned by the court he will now sit on, the U.S. Supreme Court, exactly one time. That's a pretty incredible average of decision-making if 1 out of 800 times is the only time that a court that is the Court of Appeals for you, the Supreme Court in his case, decides that your decision did not meet their view. Now, that doesn't mean that your decision didn't meet your view of the law, if you're Judge Gorsuch, or your view of the Constitution. And of course, both of those things, after today, his view of the law, his view of how you apply the law, will go to the court with him. You know, the things that Judge Gorsuch has said at the White House event where his nomination was announced, he said a good judge is not always happy with their opinions. Now, what would that mean? I thought that was a very reassuring sense that his job as a judge is to read the law, to look at the Constitution, and to determine how the facts of the case meet the reality of the law. One of the things that makes this a great country to live in, a great country to work in, a great country to take a chance in, is the one thing you can rely on, hopefully, is the rule of law. The one thing you can rely on is when good lawyers read the law, that they all understand it to mean the same thing, and you move forward with whatever decision you make on that. So what Judge Gorsuch was saying was, personal opinions aren't always satisfied by reading the law. What he also, I think, reflects is a view that the law is what the law was intended to mean at the time. There are ways to change the law. If the country's changed, the world has changed, circumstances have changed, there are ways to change the law, and that's our job. That's not the job of any federal judge anywhere, including on the Supreme Court. Their job is to determine what the law was intended to mean when it was written. Their job is to determine what the Constitution was intended to mean when it was written. And everything the Constitution intended wasn't what we'd want to live with today. And that's why we have that long list of amendments, starting with the Bill of Rights. Even immediately, the people who wrote the Constitution said, we've got to add some things to this because this doesn't mean what we really want it to mean as it's applied. So you get the Bill of Rights, but that's not the job, Madam President, of the court. That's the job of the Congress to pass laws, the president to do his job of vetoing and sending those laws back or signing them into law, and the court's job is what Judge Gorsuch understands it to be. He said in his hearings, he said, I have one client, and that client is the law. That client's not either party appearing before the court. That party's not the government. That client's not the government. That client is the law. And I think he also said, judges are not politicians in robes. We have a job to do that's different than the job of the court. And I think as we send Judge Gorsuch to the court today, to be the 113th person in the history of the country to serve on the court, we send a person that takes an understanding of what a judge should do that most Americans, when they think about what the court is supposed to do, would clearly understand that is the job of the court. There are other jobs to be done, and they're to be done other places. I think he'll be a great addition to the court. I think 10 years of experience as a judge who is the judge that other federal judges' cases are appealed to. What great training he has had to be ready for the court. And then, of course, to get this job done, we had to return to the traditional standard that has always been the standard in the country until the last few years for how presidential nominations are dealt with. Easy to confuse, I think, the unique role of the Senate in having some barriers that the House doesn't have to advancing legislation. Since basically 1789, that's been applied to legislation. The Senate has always seen its job as we want to be sure that the minority is heard before we move forward. But starting in 1789, there was never a supermajority for presidential nominations, whether it was to their cabinet or the court. It is impossible to find, even before 1968, any case where the Senate came together and said, we're officially going to decide we're not going to have a vote on this judge. Now, not every judge got a vote, but when every judge got a vote, a majority of senators determined whether that judge would go on the court or not. 2 members of the court today didn't get 60 votes. Clarence Thomas got 52 votes. I think Judge Alito got 58 votes, but 2 members didn't get 60 votes, but nobody thought they needed 60 votes because that had never been part of the structure of how judges got to the court. So I think what we've done this week is return the Senate to essentially the practice on presidential nominees that for 214 years was the way nominees were always dealt with. In 2013, the Senate, controlled by our friends on the other side of the aisle, decided that there are roughly 1,250, 1,300 presidential nominations. They decided that every nomination that was available to them, every judge where there was a vacancy, every person the president might have had a vacancy to fill, would be determined by a simple majority. From that moment on, everybody, I think, should not have been surprised that when you eventually had a Supreme Court vacancy, and this is the first one since that happened, that whoever was in charge would extend that same majority to the Supreme Court. So now all presidential nominees are back to where they were for 214 years. But I heard the minority leader, I heard my friend Mr. Schumer talk about the importance of us recommitting ourselves to the protections for the minority in passing legislation. Madam President, I think we can do that. And frankly, I think this exercise of refreshing our minds on how legislation has always been handled in that way, I believe has probably created a greater commitment to that, to the legislative supermajority to move forward with debate than we've had for a while. I think the leader of our friends on the other side, certainly the leader on our side, have both said nobody is willing to back down on the challenges that the Senate faces when we're required to come together to get things done. You know, the Senate, even if it was a majority vote, and the Senate's unique in that voters essentially, it takes 6 years for every senator to have run for election after some new sense of the direction of the country occurs. Voters basically have to say again and again, and maybe a third time, no, we really want to change the way the country has run up until now. Quick decisions are not necessarily the best decisions in a democracy, and in our democracy, this institution, the Senate, is the legislative institution that determines that there is a necessary either coming together of the people who are here at the time or voters to say another time, no, you didn't get it the first time. We are sending different people because we really want to make this change. So I think that the vote today, in the traditions of the country, sends that 113th person in the history of America to serve a lifetime term on the court. I am confident that the president's nominee and the Senate's decision to send that nominee to the court sends a good person to the court with a good understanding of what the Supreme Court of the United States is supposed to be. Their job is not to look at the law and try to determine what it should have said, or to look at the Constitution and determine what it should have said, but to look at the law and the Constitution and determine what it says. Judge Gorsuch, as well as any person who's ever appeared before the Senate to stand available for that job, understands that principle, will take that principle to the court, will work with his colleagues, as he has in the 10th Circuit, to rally around what the law says and what people can rely on in a country where our freedoms should be secure, and we should know that the courts are there to determine what is right in any given case, not what the judges think would be their idea of what would be right. And I look forward to the vote later this morning and to see Judge Gorsuch sworn in as a member of the court sometime in the very, very near future.